Chapter 13, Sections 2 and 3 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 13. The Principate of Tiberius, continued. Section 2 and 3. Section 2. Rise of Sejanus. Death of Drusus. The death of Germanicus removed difficulties from the path of Tiberius in regard to the succession. It had been difficult for him to hold the balance evenly between Germanicus and his own son. How precisely he endeavoured to make no distinction between them is shown by a coin of Sardis, where Drusus comes first in the inscription, but Germanicus sits on the right hand in the picture. Drusus was morally and intellectually inferior to his cousin, but was deeply attached to him, and after his death acted as a father to his children. The attitude of Tiberius to Germanicus seems to have been much like that of Augustus to Tiberius himself. From a feeling of duty to the state, he might acquiesce in the designation of his nephew as his successor, but his affection prompted him to prefer Drusus, though the father and son were not always on the best of terms. After the mysterious death of Germanicus, he set himself to secure the succession of Drusus, to the exclusion of his nephew's children. Ovations had been decreed to both the young Caesars for the successful discharge of their tasks in Armenia and Illyricum. The pacifier of Armenia never returned to Rome, but Drusus celebrated his ovation in 20 A.D., and in the following year held the consulship for the second time. In 22 A.D. his father raised him to the position of an imperial consort, by causing the Senate and the people to confer upon him the tribunician power. But though the emperor seemed to have cause to regard his nephew's death as a piece of good luck, his hopes for his son were destined to be frustrated. Drusus had married the sister of Germanicus, the younger Livia, generally called Livilla to distinguish her from the wife of Augustus. She was beautiful, ambitious, and unscrupulous, and seems to have had an ally in her namesake, the Augusta. She was seduced into an intrigue with Sejanus, the handsome and powerful prefect of the guards, who pretended to be in love with her and flattered her ambitious hopes with promises of marriage and the imperial throne, if the hindrance which stood in their way were once removed. Sejanus was a native of Volsinii in Etruria, and belonged to the equestrian class. In his youth he had served on the staff of Gaius Caesar. By his address and tact he had worked himself into the confidence of Tiberius, and had at length become indispensable as an adviser and semi-official minister. The emperor did not dream how high the ambition of his favourite soared, for Sejanus was not content with being the right hand of his master, he longed to occupy himself the highest position in the state. But Tiberius was thoroughly blinded by his useful and servile instrument, and used to throw off his habitual reserve in his intercourse with Sejanus. He even went so far as to call the prefect, not only in private conversation, but in his addresses to the Senate and people, the associate of my labours, and allowed his busts to be placed in the theatres and fora. But these marks of favour were given freely, just because it never entered the thought of Tiberius that a man of the origin and position of Sejanus could possibly be dangerous. Drusus saw more deeply into the character of his father's favourite, and murmured at the influence which an alien hand had acquired at the expense of a son. On one occasion he raised his hand to strike the hated prefect. Sejanus, who had already begun to pave his way to the throne by arranging an alliance between his own daughter and a son of Claudius, the brother of Germanicus, determined to sweep Drusus from his path. Suddenly Drusus died, 23 A.D., seemingly of an accidental illness, but 8 years after it was discovered that poison had been administered to him by the machinations of his wife Livilla and her paramour Sejanus. It was a heavy blow to Tiberius. The children of his son were still too young to be designated as his successors, and nothing was left but to adopt Nero and Drusus, the eldest sons of Germanicus. He led the youths before the Senate and recommended them as the future rulers of the state. Sejanus, who had divorced his wife Apicata, proposed to marry Livilla, but Tiberius forbade the union, which could only lead to new candidates for power. the prefect was driven to frame new plans. He resolved to destroy the family of Germanicus. Tiberius was now surrounded by 4 imperial widows, who made his court a scene of perpetual jealousy and intrigue. These were his mother Livia and his daughter-in-law Livilla, his sister-in-law Antonia, and Agrippina. The will of Augustus had left Livia a share in the supreme power, and she desired to exert it. Her name appeared with that of her son on the imperial rescripts. Tiberius was unable to shake off her influence, while he deprecated her interference in public affairs, and she had a strong party of adherents in the senate, who proposed to call her Mater Patriae. The ambition of the strong-minded Agrippina had been disappointed by the death of her husband, but she hoped to rise again through her children. Her chastity and fertility made her an ideal Roman matron, but she had a violent temper and an unbridled tongue. She regarded the Emperor as her natural enemy, and the leniency which was shown to her rival Plancina filled her with resentment. Nor was she satisfied even when her sons, Nero and Drusus, were marked out as the successors of Tiberius. The fulfilment of her ambitious dreams seemed still too far away. After the death of Drusus, Tiberius leaned more and more on Sejanus, and from this period the Romans remarked a degeneration in the home government. The prefect worked on the Emperor's fears by pretending to discover conspiracies against him, and many acts of cruelty were committed. But it must be noted that this change for the worse affected only the circles of nobles and officials, and did not involve any deterioration in the general prosperity of the empire. Many victims in high positions were sacrificed unjustly to suspicion and intrigue, but the Roman world as a whole was well governed. The key to the tyranny which marked the second half of the Principate of Tiberius is probably to be found in his knowledge that Agrippina had a large party of sympathizers in the senate, who, after the death of Drusus, joyfully looked forward to the succession of her children. This party he and Sejanus determined to crush out. The first victim attacked by Sejanus was C. Silius, whom we have seen doing good work on the northern frontiers, and whose wife was a friend of Agrippina. He was accused of having connived at the rebellion of Sacrovir and of extortion, and the charges pressed him so hard that he committed suicide before sentence was passed. His wife was banished, and his possessions, said to have been wrung from the provincials of Gaul, were confiscated. It is doubtful whether Cremutius Cordus, a Stoic philosopher, and author of Annals of the Republic during the period of the civil wars, was also a partisan of Agrippina. In his work he had called Cassius the last of the Romans, and although Augustus had read the book and found no fault in it, this expression was now 25 A.D. made a cause of accusation against him. It was said that his work was an attempt to excite a rebellion. Cremutius, thinking that his case was prejudged, delivered a bitter speech in the senate, and returning home, starved himself to death. All that could then be done was to burn his books. In the following year, 26 A.D., the Dolators attacked Agrippina through her cousin Claudia Pulchra. They charged this lady with the crime of adultery, and also with having made attempts on the Emperor's life by poison and magic. Thereupon Agrippina sought the presence of Tiberius, and found him sacrificing to the divinity of his father. "The same man," she cried, "cannot offer victims to the divine Augustus and persecute his posterity." Stung by the reproaches which she heaped upon him, Tiberius quoted a Greek verse to this effect: "My daughter, have I done you wrong because you are not a queen?" On the news of the condemnation of her cousin, Agrippina fell dangerously ill. When Tiberius visited her, she besought him to permit her to take a second husband. To such a step there were the same objections which he had opposed to the union of Livilla and Sejanus, but Tiberius deemed it more prudent not to urge them then, and he left the room abruptly. This anecdote was told in the memoirs of Agrippina's daughter, the mother of Nero. Such scenes as these were calculated to widen the breach between Agrippina and Tiberius, and suspicions of her kinsman were artfully distilled, by the contrivance of Sejanus, into the mind of the princess. She became possessed of the idea that the emperor was planning to poison her, and when she was invited to sup with him, she absolutely refused to partake of any of the food that was presented to her. This undisguised declaration of her suspicions alienated the emperor still more. Section 3. Tiberius at Capreae. Influence of Sejanus and his fall. Hitherto Tiberius had resided continually at Rome and devoted himself assiduously to the conduct of affairs. He had constantly talked of visiting the provinces, and even made the preliminary arrangements for the journey, but when it came to the point he had always found a pretext for not going. He never went further from the city than Antium. But as he grew older, in 26 A.D. he had reached the age of 67, his reserve, his distrust of his fellow creatures, his dislike to the pomp of public life seemed to have increased. He had always been reserved, sensitive, and shy. His temper had been soured by disappointments, both in his early life and in his recent years. His unpopularity in Rome, of which he was fully conscious, may have irritated him more as he became older, and his domestic life was full of worry, with Livia and Livilla on one side and Agrippina on the other. All this might be enough to explain the motives which led him to take the momentous step of abandoning Rome and living permanently elsewhere. But if such motives operated, their effect was supported by the persuasions of the favourite Sejanus, who desired nothing better than to remove the emperor to a distance, so as to have a free scene for his own plans. It is possible, however, that Tiberius may have been decided by a political motive. He may have wished to give Nero, the eldest son of Germanicus, an opportunity of gradually undertaking an active part in the government, and assisting him somewhat as he had himself assisted Augustus. Silly and malicious stories were circulated by the emperor's enemies. It was said that he sought a place of concealment for the practice of licentiousness, or that he wished to hide from the public view a face and figure deformed by old age. He left Rome, 26 A.D., on the pretext of consecrating a temple of Jupiter at Capua, and a temple of Augustus at Nola, recently built. His attendants were one senator, Cocceius Nerva, 2 knights, Sejanus and another, and some men of science and astrologers. During the emperor's progress in Campania, an accident happened, which increased his confidence in Sejanus. The imperial party were dining at a country house called the Cave, Spelunca, formed of a natural grotto between the Gulf of Amyclae and the hills of Fundi. The rocks at the entrance suddenly fell in and crushed some of the servants, and the guests fled in panic. Sejanus placed himself in front of the emperor, and received the falling stones. The incident convinced Tiberius that his prefect was a man who had no care for himself. Having dedicated the temples, he proceeded to the little island of Capreae, which Augustus, struck by its salubrious climate, had purchased from the people of Neapolis. Lonely and difficult to approach by its precipitous lime cliffs, yet near enough to the mainland, this island, about 11 miles in circuit and rising at either end to higher points of vantage, was an attractive retreat for the wearied statesman. 12 villas were built in Tiberias in various parts of the island, which was vigilantly guarded from intrusion. But while his subjects thought that he had entirely relinquished the conduct of affairs to the praetorian prefect, and was spending his days in consultation with his astrologers or in foul debauchery, Tiberius still bestowed constant attention to the details of public business. But he no longer troubled himself to suppress the servility of the senate, or to check the abuses of delation. Many innocent men were betrayed by the indefatigable informers, and the senators lived in fear and peril of their lives. The case of Titus Sabinus, a Roman knight who was tried and put to death in 28 A.D., was an episode in the struggle between Sejanus and the party of Agrippina, to which Sabinus belonged. Sabinus, who had been a friend of Germanicus, had made himself conspicuous by the attention which he paid to the wife and children of that prince after his death. 4 ex-praetors, who wished to obtain the consulship and sought for that purpose to ingratiate themselves with Sejanus, conceived the idea that the destruction of Sabinus would be an effectual means of winning the favourite's favour. Accordingly they laid a plot. One of them, named Latinius Latiaris, who was slightly acquainted with Sabinus, entered one day into conversation with him, praised him for not having abandoned the house of Germanicus in the hour of adversity, and spoke in compassionate terms of Agrippina. Sabinus, who was of a soft nature, took Latiaris completely into his confidence, burst into invectives against the cruelty of Sejanus, and did not spare Tiberius himself. Several treasonable conversations took place, but as it was necessary to have more witnesses, and as Sabinus would not have spoken freely in the presence of others, the three accomplices hid themselves between the ceiling and the roof in a room in the house of Latiaris, who induced Sabinus to visit him there on the plea of making a disclosure. The utterances of the entrapped knight on this occasion were quite sufficient for his condemnation, and the conspirators immediately dispatched a letter to the Emperor informing him of the treason of Sabinus. Tiberius, in his letter to the senate on January 1, 28 A.D., mentioned the treasonable designs of Sabinus and suggested that it might be well to punish him. The senate condemned him to death without hesitation, and received a letter of thanks from Tiberius, hinting, however, that he still apprehended treachery, but without mentioning names. He was supposed to allude to Agrippina and her son Nero. The year 29 A.D. was marked by the death of Livia, or, as she was publicly called, Julia Augusta, at the age of 86. Her funeral oration was pronounced by Gaius, the third son of Agrippina, then in his 17th year. Tiberius did not regret his imperious mother. The funeral was marked by little ceremony. The senate was forbidden to decree her divine honours. Her will remained long unexecuted. The memory of Livia has been much wronged by history. The consort of Augustus is forgotten in the mother of Tiberius, and it is only remembered that she had done much to raise to the throne an unpopular ruler, whom the Romans cursed as a tyrant. There is no reason to suppose, however, that her influence, exerted in the interests of clemency, sometimes thwarted Sejanus, and it is worthy of notice that he did not carry out his design against Agrippina until after the death of Livia. It has ever been said that her death was a turning point in the reign. Her friends who, under her powerful protection, had ventured to speak somewhat boldly against the emperor, were persecuted when she died. Conspicuous among these was the husband of the emperor's divorced wife Vipsania, Asinius Gallus, who was confined in prison for 3 years and then put to death. The body of Livia had not been long bestowed in the mausoleum of Augustus, when the senate received a letter from Tiberius, containing charges against Agrippina and Nero. The son was charged with gross licentiousness, the mother with insolence and a contumacious spirit. There was no hint of disloyalty or treason, and the emperor did not signify what he wished the senate to do. The people assembled outside the doors of the senate house, and cried that the letter was a forgery, hinting that it was the work of Sejanus, and bearing aloft the images of Agrippina and Nero. A second message soon came from Capreae, rebuking the citizens for their rebellious behaviour, and urging the senate to take definite action on the charges against the accused. The servile senators found them guilty, and they were banished to barren islands, Agrippina to Pandateria, and Nero to Pontia. Agrippina's second son Drusus still remained, but his fall too was speedily contrived by Sejanus. Just as he had seduced Livilla to compass the death of the elder Drusus, so now he seduced Lepida, the wife of the younger Drusus, and suborned her to calumniate her husband to Tiberius. Drusus, who with his younger brother Gaius lived at Capreae, was sent to Rome as a mark of disgrace, and the senate hastened to declare him a public enemy. For the right of declaring an individual a public enemy, as of declaring war, still belonged to the senate. He was then arrested and imprisoned in the palace. The power of Sejanus had now reached its highest point. He was regarded with greater awe than the emperor himself. He seemed to be the true sovereign, and Tiberius the mere lord of an island, Nesiarch. Altars were raised and sacrifices offered before his statues, games were voted in his honour, but his fall was at hand. Tiberius had become jealous and suspicious of the designs of his minister, and the graver his suspicions became, the more assiduously did he seek to disguise them until the time should come for the final blow. He loaded the prefect with honours. He betrothed him to his granddaughter Julia, the widow of Nero, who had died in exile at Pontia, and he conferred on him the honour of being his colleague in the consulship. This honour also furnished him with a pretext of ridding himself of the prefect's presence at Capreae. Sejanus was sent to Rome and to perform the functions of the consuls on behalf of both himself and Tiberius, and he was received with abject flattery by the senate and people. The senate decreed the consulate to him along with Tiberius for 5 years, and he was disappointed when Tiberius insisted on resigning it in the 5th month, 31 A.D. The messages, which from time to time arrived from Capreae, were uncertain and puzzling. Tiberius intended to keep Sejanus in a state of restless uncertainty. he conferred upon him the proconsular power and raised him to the dignity of a priest, but at the same time he mentioned his nephew Gaius Caesar with great favour, and conferred a priesthood on him also. Sejanus felt uneasy, and besought Tiberius to allow him to return to Capreae to see his betrothed bride, who was ill. The request was refused on the ground that the Emperor and his family were about to visit Rome. In a letter to the senate which arrived soon after, Sejanus was mentioned without the addition of his titles, and it was forbidden to yield divine honours to a mortal. Besides this, the enemies of the prefect were treated with favour. These things seemed to forebode disgrace, and Sejanus resolved to forestall his fall by overthrowing his master. A conspiracy was formed to kill Tiberius when he came to Rome, but Satrius Secundus, one of the conspirators, betrayed the plot to Antonia, and she hastened to reveal it to her brother-in-law. It would hardly have been safe to denounce openly the treason of Sejanus. To strike down the prefect of the praetorian guards required caution and cunning. Tiberius selected a trusted officer, Sertorius Macro, to succeed Sejanus as prefect, and instructed him how he was to proceed. When Macro reached Rome, October 17th, it was midnight. He immediately sought the house of the consul Memmius Regulus, and, having revealed the purpose of his coming, caused him to summon a meeting of the senate, early in the morning, in the temple of Apollo on the Palatine. This place of meeting was perhaps chosen in order that, if a disturbance should arise, Drusus, who was a captive in the adjoining palace, might readily be produced. Macro then visited Graecinus Laco, the commander of the cohortes vigilum, and arranged with him that the approaches to the temple should be guarded. In the morning, as Sejanus was proceeding to the senate, attended by an armed retinue, Macro met him and disarmed his suspicions by informing him that the business of the meeting would be to confer the tribunician power on Sejanus himself. This power was the only thing wanting to his association in the empire, and Sejanus thought that his highest ambition was about to be fulfilled. When Sejanus had entered the temple, Macro informed the praetorians that he had been appointed their new prefect, and returned with them to their camp, as soon as he had given the emperor's letter to the consuls. This great wordy epistle from Capreae, which sounded the doom of Sejanus, began with some remarks on general matters, and then proceeded to a slight rebuke of Sejanus, then passed to some indifferent matters again, and finally demanded the punishment of Sejanus himself and some of his intimate friends. During the long recital of the letter, the suspense of the audience was intense, for none knew how it would end. Then the senators, who had been heaping Sejanus with congratulations, left his side. The consul ordered the lictors to seize him, and he was hurried off to prison. The people showed how much they rejoiced in the fall of the hated tyrant by hurling down his statues. The senate, when they saw the temper of the populace, and as the praetorian guards did not intervene, met at a later hour of the same day in the temple of Concord, and sentenced Sejanus to death. He was immediately strangled in the prison, and his corpse was dragged by the executioner's hook to the Scalae Gemoniae, according to the usual custom in the reign of Tiberius. His death was followed by the execution of his family and friends. The senate decreed that a statue of Liberty should be set up in the Forum, and that the anniversary of the traitor's fall should be solemnly kept as a day of deliverance. Tiberius had in the meantime been agitated with fear and suspense. He had a fleet in waiting, ready to bear him to the east, in case Macro failed in the enterprise, and he posted himself on the highest cliff of the island, to watch for the appointed signal of success or failure. The fall of Sejanus was a relief to him, but it was soon followed by a horrible revelation. Apicata, the divorced wife of the fallen prefect, sent to Tiberius a full account of the details of the death of Drusus, showing how it had been compassed by Sejanus and Livilla, and having revealed this long-kept secret, she put an end to her life. The revelation was confirmed by the testimony of the slaves concerned in the affair, and the guilty Livilla was punished with death. The overthrow of Sejanus brought no alleviation to the miseries of Agrippina in her island or her son Drusus in his prison. It is not clear why the emperor determined to destroy Drusus. Perhaps he thought that one so deeply injured would be dangerous if released. He allowed him to perish by starvation, and then wrote a letter to the Senate, describing minutely the manner of his death, even the curses which in his last moments he had vented against Tiberius himself. The object of this strange communication, which excited the horror of the senators, is not evident. Perhaps it was intended to show beyond doubt that Drusus was really dead, for an impostor, pretending to be Drusus, had recently created some disturbances in Greece and Asia. The death of Agrippina by voluntary abstinence from food soon followed that of her son. The senate, at the Emperor's wish, decreed that her birthday should be ill-omened, and remarked that her death took place on the anniversary of the execution of Sejanus, 18th October, 33 A.D. The bodies of her children were not admitted to the mausoleum of the family until the reign of Gaius, who exhumed them from the lowly tombs in which they had been thrown. The prosecutions of those who were supposed to have been connected with the conspiracy of Sejanus were protracted over a year, but at length, in 33 A.D., the Emperor, weary of the proceedings, issued an order for the summary execution of all who were still detained in prison, whether men, women, or children. A certain Marcus Terentius, who was impeached in the Senate on the ground of friendship with Sejanus, is reported to have made a bold speech. Others had repudiated their friendly relations with the fallen prefect, but he candidly acknowledged that he was the friend of Sejanus, had eagerly sought to be such, and was delighted when he succeeded. "Do not think, fathers," he said, "only of the last day of Sejanus, but of his 16 years of power. To be known even to his freedmen and hall porters was regarded as a distinction. Let plots against the state, conspiracies for the murder of the Emperor, be punished. But as to friendship, the same issue of our friendship to Sejanus must absolve alike you, Caesar, and us." Terentius was saved by his boldness, and his accusers were condemned to banishment or death, according to the nature of their previous offences. But if a rare senator spoke out boldly, most of the order made the fall of the minister an occasion for obsequiousness. Some went so far in their proposals that they drew upon themselves the ridicule or severe censure of Tiberius. Thus Togonius Gallus begged the Emperor to choose a number of senators, of whom 20 should be selected by lot as a bodyguard whenever he entered the Curia. This man had actually taken seriously a letter of the Emperor asking for the protection of a consul from Capreae to Rome. Tiberius, who had a fashion of combining jest and seriousness, thanked the senators for their kindness, but suggested several difficulties. Who were to be chosen? Were they to be always the same? Were they to be men who had held office, or youths? And would it not be strange to see persons taking up swords on the threshold of the senate house? But if he knew how to answer a fool according to his folly, he could also sharply rebuke an impertinence. Junius Gallio proposed that the praetorian soldiers, having served their allotted time, should have the right of sitting among the knights in the 14 rows of the theatre. Tiberius asked what he had to do with the praetorian guards, who received their commands and their rewards only from the imperator, and suggested that Gallio was one of the satellites of Sejanus, seeking to tamper with the soldiery. Gallio was then, in return for his flattery, expelled from the Senate and banished from Italy. Recent experiences had aggravated the Emperor's suspicious nature. He became more difficult to access, and committed many acts of cruelty. His faithful adviser, Cocceius Nerva, who was his companion at Capreae, weary, it is said, of seeing the harshness of his sovereign, put himself to death, in spite of the prayers and remonstrances of Tiberius. Of the 20 members of the imperial consilium, there soon remained only 2 or 3. The others had been the victims of delation. Public report ascribed to Tiberius a life of bestial debauchery in the inaccessible island, and the Parthian king actually addressed to him an impertinent rebuke for his licentious habits, and called upon him to satisfy public opinion by committing suicide. There is little doubt that Tiberius lived licentiously, like most of the Roman nobles of those days. But there is no doubt also that his dissipations have been foully exaggerated. The circumstance that his life was prolonged to nearly 80 years without medical aid is enough to make us hesitate to accept the stories which were circulated about the orgies at Capreae. End of chapter 13, sections 2 and 3.